As many? To recognize Honourable Member for Foxhill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In rising to support this amendment, the Banks and Trust Companies Regulation Amendment Bill, I'd like to speak for a few minutes about the question of our financial services sector and the reputation which that sector has around the world. And secondly, I wanted to talk about some of the issues that were raised prior to my speaking in the debate about the banking practices in the Bahamas, how we ought to consider them, the context in which many of these practices take place, and what we ought to do about them if there is in fact anything that we can do. My understanding about the place we are today in this sector is that we made a public policy decision back in the year 2000 to accommodate ourselves to the end of the financial services sector as we knew it. In fact, some people had pronounced that bank secrecy had gone out of the window and a new era was heralded of accountability and transparency in the banking sector as a means of protecting the ability of the country to continue to have a financial services sector which would be able to employ the many thousands of Bahamians who make an excellent living in this sector. Notwithstanding that decision made in 2000 and the accompanying legal and regulatory changes, we have seen a shrinking of the sector in the country. And many Bahamians who found themselves making a good living in the sector no longer do so. It appears that every time we turn around, there is a new assault from outside the country on the financial services sector and its ability to continue to provide the services that it does for people who have wealth that they want to manage. As Foreign Minister, and at one time as Minister for International Trade, I've made the case around the world that there is still a reason for privacy and the protection of one's privacy as it relates to your wealth. And the Bahamas offers the ability to have a well-regulated jurisdiction without criminal monies for those people who want to protect their privacy and their wealth and at the same time have it well managed. And that's what we continue to offer to the world. So I believe it is fair to say that a bill such as this, an amending statute, is being passed today and must be seen in the context of our seeking to ensure that best practices obtain in the sector, that the international standards which are broadly accepted around the world for the banking sector are embraced and find themselves in the legislation which we utilize to protect the integrity and good standing of the sector in the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. It has been a very difficult time for the sector and a difficult time for Bahamians to accept these intrusions from the outside. But all of the policymakers thus far have accepted that there is a balancing act that has to be accepted, and that on balance, this is the better way to go. Mr. Speaker, Clause 6 of the bill says the following: the Principal Act is amended by the insertion immediately after Section 3C of the following new sections. And I want to read a couple of lines. Firstly, new Section 3D, where it says, a group of persons may, where the group proposes to form a company for the purpose of carrying on a banking business or a trust business, make application to the central bank for an intimation as to whether or not the company will be authorized to carry on such business upon its incorporation. And then it goes on to determine how a person is fit and proper. The member from the opposition who spoke before me indicated that he was having some difficulty determining what a fit and proper person was, but it seems to me that the answer is right there in the bill, and it explains quite clearly what a fit and proper person is. In any case, I'm certain that the expression fit and proper has been judicially decided that it's probably now trite law. But it says the central bank shall, in determining for the purposes of this act whether a person is a fit and proper person, have regard to all the circumstances, including such person's honesty, integrity, and reputation, competence and capability, financial soundness, and previous disciplinary record and general compliance history, including whether the central bank or any other domestic regulatory authority or a supervisory authority has previously imposed a disciplinary sanction on such a person. So that seems to say quite clearly what fit and proper means. What I hope is that this definition, fit and proper, and this procedure does not mean that it will become more difficult for Bahamians to form a bank in the Bahamas. That is a complaint which many people who have accumulated wealth in the Bahamas want to go into the banking business, but find, they say, that there are too many hoops through which they have to jump in order to qualify to start a bank in the Bahamas as Bahamians. And this becomes important because we have a history post-1967 of promoting a policy in the Bahamas that says economic empowerment is important for ordinary Bahamians, that having won the political battle of majority rule, it was important to empower Bahamians across the economy so that Bahamians who had previously been poor and dispossessed, would be able to seize the commanding heights of our economy. And this is something which has eluded government after government. The last administration under the Right Honourable member for Centerville tried to implement a number of programs which would provide venture capital for Bahamians to get into business. Following that, there were some attempts by the administration prior to us, and this time again, we have a venture capital fund which is available for people who want to go into business. The member who spoke from the opposition before talked about the unemployment rate and how it adversely affects young people, and that it is somewhere around 30% for people under the age of 35, or for young people. And so capital accumulation, the ability to have a bank, the ability to lend to others, to be able to venture into new enterprises becomes all part of the whole cloth of how we grow the economy and how we provide employment for the people of the Bahamas. Entrepreneurship is a great part of that. I was representing our country at an economic seminar in Doha last year. And one of the issues they raised was the same question of youth unemployment in their region, in the Middle East. And they said that by the year 2050, that they would have to produce 50 million jobs to be able to deal with the unemployment in their region. Now, our region doesn't have the same numbers, 50 million new jobs in order to keep up with the growth of their population and to deal with the employment problem. But here's the interesting bit for me, from a policy point of view. And they said they had come to the conclusion that the old model of someone graduating from school or from university and then going to a business and finding a job was essentially out the window and had become passé. And that they had discovered that the only way they would be able to cope with the demand for jobs was through entrepreneurship, meaning people would have to work for themselves. And the question is, how are you going to get the capital to do that? We've had an example within the last week here where some of the web shop owners announced that they will be providing grants for entrepreneurs. And I thought that this was a laudatory effort on their part. And in fact, we know in the run-up to the passage of the gambling legislation what the difficulties were for those who were in that sector to be able to bank the large sums of capital that had been accumulated by their own entrepreneurship. And the question is, now that they have these large sums of capital accumulated, would this group, or would these group of people who have these large sums of money, would they be able to apply to our central bank under these provisions and meet the fit and proper test to be able to form a bank which would be able to do some of the things that they are now doing as volunteers through a Bahamian bank. And we've been trying at this for a long time, because you have to remember the People's Penny Savings Bank, when those men back in the 1950s had the same idea of weaning themselves off the status quo and being able to get capital and start up the bank and make it successful. Today, by dint of the government's purchase of the bank, we own the Bank of the Bahamas. And, you know, all the criticism of the Bank of the Bahamas about its loans and the loan provisioning and all the rest of it. But I'm told by those people who know about this sort of thing, said the one thing you can say about the Bank of the Bahamas was that it was the one bank in the country that actually tried to help Bahamian entrepreneurs. The one bank. And I was really quite interested in the article which the member read, because it's been circulated, I think, widely amongst us. And Mr. Speaker, the comment I want to make is about the morality of Canadian banks. The morality of Canadian banks and their practices in the Bahamas. I quite frankly don't understand this situation. I was passing through my constituency, and there was a home that, let's say 12 months ago, I sought to intervene with one of the banks and asked them if they would come to an arrangement for these folk to be able to pay a lesser sum in order for them to protect their home. I got no answer. But when I went through the neighborhood sometime later, I found that the people were out of their home, and there was grass growing up around the home, and it was clear that the home was in the position of being vandalized. And here's the question about the morality or the ethics of it. So I wrote the bank, and I said a couple of things. First of all, the bank never loses. Never mind all the stuff you hear about provisioning and all the rest of it. The interest continues to accumulate. It never stops. And you have to pay it off. And they make you pay it off to the bitter end. So if you strike a bargain with them, and I mean, I guess the morality is clear. You agreed to pay the interest rate, but circumstances obtain, and sometimes you look at changing the agreement that you made. And I don't see anything wrong with being able to go and renegotiate a position if you find yourself into a problem. And particularly from this point of view, Mr. Speaker, there was an era in this country when all of the banks, without exception, pushed credit like they were pouring water out of a spigot. For every description, there was an era prior to 2008 when that's what they did. Now, the credit officers were given certain targets that they had to meet, and they went out and met those targets. And after 2008, there's a crash, and a couple of consequences flowed. One is suddenly the credit officers, who were Bahamian, were being blamed for pushing too much credit, saying they're the ones who caused the problems for the banks by pushing too much credit, when in fact the quotas were set for them. Then the banks themselves accepted no moral responsibility for pushing credit on people. You know, there was a time when, I remember, I'd just come back from law school, there was a time when a bank, they were in the business of competing with, they were trying to establish a beachhead here for credit. Yeah, so they sent me a pre-approved $20,000 limit for a new credit card. Just send it to me in the mail. Said, just sign here, send it back to us. You have $20,000 unsecured. Do whatever you want with a new credit card. Fortunately, I threw it in the garbage tin. But that's what was happening. Now, when people got into problems, because of that, they accepted the bank that advertised these generous terms, accepted no moral responsibility for pushing credit on people. And that becomes important because it seems to me it forms part of another part of the equation, which is this, that if you accept that you have some moral responsibility for pushing credit out on people, you should also accept some responsibility for renegotiating the deal after the thing goes bad. Because after all, both parties were guilty. The one who accepted the generous credit, and you for pushing it out on them. That's what I think is the moral argument. And so I think whether it is on consumer loans or whether it's dealing with mortgages, the banks, in my view, have a moral obligation to settle these matters with people and to take a haircut if it's necessary, because they never lose. And so to get back to the example of the house, I wrote the bank, and the bank said to me, look, I appreciate everything you're saying. I sympathize with what you say. But sorry, there's nothing we can do. They didn't pay. Sorry, that's the end of the matter. Yeah, people may break up the house and so on and so forth, but the real problem in the Bahamas is unemployment. And until we fix that problem, the banks can't really solve the problem. So that's the attitude. Now, I'm sure when you speak to them off the side, they will tell you of many cases of people they've helped and, so on and so forth. But my point is, Mr. Speaker, it's not enough. It's not enough. And I think that in the absence of legislation, I think legislation is clearly the way to deal with this. But I think that in the absence of legislation, and I believe the minister is working in that direction, but in the absence of legislation, I think we have to speak about this, talk about it in public, beat the bushes, to change the conversation, to ensure that that moral argument about this whole lending business is successfully sold to the country as the way to go. And then I think it makes the case for the legislation easier to accomplish. And certainly on behalf of those constituents who are in Fox Hill who are in that issue, in that problem. I mean, there's a new subdivision in my area where people borrowed twice, borrowed the down payment and borrowed the principal. They did that, a whole subdivision. And the banks found nothing wrong with that. They must have known that people were taking on two loans. And anyone, I mean, you just have to where Joseph was asked to interpret Pharaoh's dream. And Pharaoh's dream clearly was about the 7 years of plenty and the seven lean years. So what that tells you is that life is a cycle. So the banks must have known, everybody must know, that it's not always going to be good. So the deal must have contemplated that at some point there was going to be a problem. And you should be able to renegotiate the deal. So I hope that this provision does not make it more difficult for Bahamians who want to go into the banking business and help to accumulate capital, to go into venture capital, to lend to businesses so that entrepreneurs can get a start, and all within the context of proper standards and best practices and making sure that the reputation of our banking sector is intact. Mr. Speaker, the region at the moment is worried about an additional issue. And that issue was raised by the Prime Minister of Antigua and Barbuda, who talked about what he understands is a new push from outside the region to say that this is not, that our local banks are not banks that international banks want to do business with. And so the correspondent relationships are being jeopardized. Now, what that means, as I understand it, is if you are a local bank, Bahamian bank, Guyanese bank, Trinidadian bank, in order for your checks to clear across borders, you have to have a correspondent relationship with a bank outside the country. And many banks have been using, many of these international banks, overseas banks, have been using the fact of these new rules and regulations to say that our jurisdictions aren't well managed and aren't well regulated. And so, therefore, they no longer want to have correspondent relationships with these banks. You can imagine if this happens with Bahamian banks. That means that you can no longer do business overseas. That means your work is crippled. And so an ad hoc group was put together of representatives of countries at the most recent CARICOM meeting, chaired by the Right Honourable Member for Centerville, to deal with this issue prospectively to see what, if any, impacts there are possible in the Bahamas. I'm told that the argument is more subtle than at first blush. What they're arguing is not that the jurisdictions aren't well regulated. They're arguing that the cost of those banks overseas having to monitor our jurisdictions to make sure that we are regulated is so high that the cost of business is too high for them to continue. And on the basis of that, they no longer want to continue the relationship. Whatever the reason, if this is something which is coming down the road, this is something which we must be conscious of and try to do our best to protect our banks from any losses. Finally, Mr. Speaker, I want to say a bit about again, going back to this article about Canadian banks and whether they're going to withdraw and whether they're going to close down and so on and so forth. I'll use this example. During the debate on value-added tax, there was a particular merchant who said that if value-added tax became part of the law of the Bahamas, he would shut down his businesses and just, I guess, go on the beach. And I said that if he shut down those businesses, I would leave my job as Minister of Foreign Affairs and go into the business he was in, because I was sure there was going to be a vacuum. You know, nature abhors a vacuum, and the money possibilities would be so infinite that I'm sure even I could make a success out of it. Now, at the end of the day, of course, I see he most recently said he accepts that the law is the law and business is going along as usual, and I'm sure he's making ample profits in his business. So what I say is those who believe that the Canadian banks will leave, if they leave, well, you know, there'll be some dislocations, but I'm sure there'll be opportunities for others to come and fill the vacuum. So I wouldn't consider that a threat, nor would I consider that something for us to worry about as a practical possibility. The fact is, this jurisdiction makes good money for these banks, and this temporary trough is not going to cause them to withdraw and go anywhere. Not for a minute, not for a day, not for a month, not for a year, not even for an hour. They won't do it. This is a profitable business for these banks. As to the member's comment about taxes, you have to guard against a couple of things, Mr. Speaker. When I was in law school, they said parliamentarians should never draft bills on the floor of Parliament. Leave that to draftsmen. And similarly, I would argue that in terms of tax structures and tax policy, parliamentarians should not try to design tax policy on the floor of Parliament. But, you know, put your ideas in the mix and let's come out on balance with what is better by advice from the experts. Because I can immediately say, given the suggestion he made about putting luxury taxes, well, first of all, it seems to me administratively expensive and complicated. So that's the first issue. But secondly, I am certain that those adherents to his political party along this strip here at Bay Street would be howling to the rafters if if this government, on the advice of the official opposition, said we must put luxury taxes. Imagine that. These fellas here wouldn't be able to sell their gold watches because the F&M says put luxury taxes. The same F&M now, who when they were in office had duty-free. Remember, they came up with duty-free, saying that this was a way to get tourists to buy more goods on Bay Street. So, I don't know. I see. I understand. So I only send that flag up. I only send that flag up. When you start applying luxury taxes, the group that supports you will be howling from the rafters, and I only send you fair warning. Mr. Speaker, I support the bill.